Welcome to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. And let's get some pictures going here. Yeah, sponsored by opednews.com, available on iTunes, Progressive Radio Network, on Pacifica, and Stitcher. The show is based on my idea that we're transitioning from a predominantly top-down world to a more bottom-up culture. That's happening because the internet and smartphones have catalyzed that happening. And it's so powerful that it's produced trillions of dollars in new business. It's taken down dictators, elected presidents. It's changed the way every business operates. And the reason it's happening, and it's happening so quickly and so powerfully, is because that's the way humans existed for millions of years before there was civilization. Humans existed in hunter-gatherer bands, not even tribes, just bands. And they lived bottom-up lives where they took care of each other. They were interdependent and cooperative. And they did the kind of things that my guest today describes in his new book. So let me introduce you. My guest is Anthony Flaccavento. He's the author of a brilliant book. I just love this book, Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up. Here's the book. He's been an organic farmer for 20-some years. He ran for Congress as a Democratic candidate in Virginia. He's got a website, bottomupeconomy.org, and probably a couple more, and you're welcome to share them as well. So welcome to the show.
Oh, so pleased and flattered to be on, Rob. Thank you.
No, it's great to have you. You're doing it. I mean, your book is just loaded with it. It's like a giant wild flower garden of examples of bottom-up, local, decentralized, great things that people are actually doing. It's such an inspiring collection of examples that this is happening. This bottom-up explosion is well underway. It's happening, and I don't think it's stoppable. Because, like I said, this is built into our genes, and it's tapping and pushing on these potentials that have been repressed that are now coming out. So it's really exciting. So I wanted to start off with a couple things. One, you have a quote near the end of your book, but I want to throw it in there to get people thinking. You say, we really can't choose between better local realities and dramatic changes in the larger economic and political system. They're interchangeable. You can't separate one from the other. So if you want to see change happen, you got to do things locally, even if what you're interested in is national politics. It's just not enough. Then next, I'm going to read a quote. I'm cheating because this is from the end, but I want to inspire people here. You quote, "For as long as I live, I will not let this suffering be normal. It's important to realize what we have, why we have it, and how privileged we are. And from that place, start caring and get a lot done." Who said it?
Yeah, this wonderful young woman named Kayla Jean Mueller, who went over to Syria as a 24-year-old to get stuff done in a place of phenomenal suffering and injustice. And that quote was when she was back home visiting her folks, in Arizona, and she was quoted in the local paper as saying that when they asked her, well, why are you going to Syria? And oftentimes in my life, I think like a lot of activists and practitioners, you just get damn discouraged and you feel like, good Lord, am I making any difference at all? There's those kinds of recurring feelings. And when I think about a 24-year-old woman putting her life on the line and ultimately losing her life doing that work, and yet her attitude was, we've got so much, we can't let this kind of nonsense be normal. We've got to fight it every day. I mean, talk about a quote for our times now. That is just quite the quote.
Yeah, she was killed. She
Yes.
was killed. And it makes the way you just describe it, it makes me think of that whole boiling frog theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So first, let's start off Again, the title of the book, Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up. What does bottom up and top down mean to you? What do they mean to you?
Yeah, a lot of us have been trying to figure out what's the way to describe these new economies, sustainable economies, green, happiness. There's a lot of different terms that have been thrown around over the last couple of decades as economic alternatives have been experimented with and begun to develop. For me, the term bottom up occurred to me when I was running for Congress in 2012, and it stuck for two reasons. Number one, it's such a perfect and clear contrast with trickle down. Trickle down economics is one of the great fallacies of our time, promoted by Ronald Reagan, but still Republicans and even a lot of Democrats fully buy into this notion that if we free up a tiny class of the very wealthy and the biggest corporations, they will invest, they will use their superior resources and brain power to create economic vitality that will eventually trickle down to the rest of us.
Yeah, anytime I think it trickled down, I really think of Tinkle On.
Right. Yeah, during my campaign, occasionally I called it a suck-up economy rather than a trickle down. But the point is, there is this, it's deeply ingrained in our thinking, and not until Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders was there much of a public debate challenging that. But it's still the dominant way that people think about how we create a strong economy.
But wait, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Sure.
I still haven't heard what your definition of bottom up is.
So first of all, I was looking for a contrast with trickle down.
Okay.
So bottom up was a clear sort of semantic contrast that I thought people could grasp. But the substance of it was more than just that contrast. It's the fact that in my own work in Central Appalachia, but also traveling around much of the country, rural areas, towns, and cities, what I saw was these different kinds of economies emerging from the bottom, meaning the foundation. So there's one kind of economy that emerges in Phoenix, Arizona. There's something that's very different that emerges in Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia. There's something still quite different emerging in towns in the Midwest and rural communities. And they were all, what they had in common was that they were built around the foundation of their community, their ecological assets, their natural capital, whatever sort of culture and history was being revived and reclaimed, and sometimes also their local built environment in terms of utilizing rather than bulldozing structures and buildings. All of them were sort of...
Wait, their local what? I couldn't hear that word.
Okay, built economy. Their buildings, their built economy, okay. Like the downtown structures, things like that. Whether it was environmental capital, whether it was human capital like buildings, or whether it was cultural, they all shared this, not just a commitment, but actually a drive to make sure that the new economy they were building was built from that foundation. So it was all, every one of these initiatives, even though some of them had grown quite large by the time I wrote the book, started at the bottom with the people, their place, and the culture of that community.
Okay, I'm still not sure I've got a definition from you. You've described the people and the processes and the phenomenon you looked at, but because I call the show Bottom Up, it's the Bottom Up show. And because you've written a book about bottom up economics, I'm really trying to nail you down here.
Okay.
So, to me, now I don't want to go. I can say what my ideas are, but and so from what I hear from you so far, bottom up is local.
It's at least begins with local, yes. Mm-hmm.
Keep going. Yeah. What is bottom up?
Okay, so it's local, it's place-based. So again, every community has different sort of gaps and different sort of strengths. So it's building on your strengths and also addressing your gaps. So it's local bottom-up economies are always place-based, right? Then third, they share in common that they are ecologically sustainable. Some people refer to that as triple bottom line economics.
Yeah, what is that? Describe that.
So, the normal thing that we hear is that we have to choose between the profit making, the financial bottom line, and other things like human well-being and environmental problems. over and over, our neoliberal economy has pitted economic success, wealth, against human welfare and environmental sustainability. These bottom-up economies, again, all link the three. They see those three things, people's well-being, the ecosystem of their place, and the ability to make money and have a healthy economy as completely interchanged, as completely linked, not adversarial, but we got to have all three. So it's place-based and local. It's triple bottom line with human beings and ecosystem as part of it. And then the last thing I'd say is that the other feature that comes from that, it's the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Every one of these economies that I looked at was innovation oriented, because in most of these places, they were relatively struggling communities. There might have been a rural community that was trying to recover from the end of coal mining. It might have been an old steel town like Grand Rapids, Michigan, any of a number of different things, declining fisheries in the Northeast. And what that led to in every place, which is the last ingredient of bottom-up, was amazing innovation. Just experimentation and innovation that created synergy. And I could give you, the book gives a number of examples of that, but we could talk about one or two of them if you want.
I love it. And so, when I think of bottom up, I think it's local, it's non-hierarchical, egalitarian, interdependent, cooperative. There's compassion and caring too. These are all pieces of it. And one thing, you say it's innovative, but I think another place to find these kinds of bottom up communities is indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
And, they invented it before history.
Right. Well, and again, in part because they were driven by need. A lot of our cultural model is that we want to get to a point of affluence that we don't really need anything. We don't need each other. With that, our lives are all about some higher level of satisfying wants than needs. But as we've approached that, it's made us dumb and lazy. And it's the communities that are very in touch with basic needs, that create these innovative, synergistic economic activities. It's really almost across the board true.
Yeah, there's a book that was written almost 50 years ago called The Original Affluent Society. And they're indigenous people, the people who some people call primitives. They only worked 2 or 3 hours a day, and they were happy and had all they needed.
Yeah. Another example from far away, not in the book, I had the opportunity to do a little consulting work in Australia last summer around food system work, and it was great. It was wonderful, first time ever there for me. But there I met a gentleman who had written a book called Dark Emu, like the ostrich-type bird, Dark Emu, which is all about what they're now discovering, that the indigenous people of Australia, in fact, were incredibly ahead of the curve. They're way ahead of the Europeans, tens of thousands of years ahead of the Europeans in advanced agriculture and human settlements, where when the Europeans came there and conquered them, they dismissed them as fools and ignorant and everything else. Turns out they're now finding all of this evidence that, in fact, they had a highly evolved agricultural system, food storage, transportation, and social relationships among the Aboriginals. So
yeah, well, I got this big smile on my face because a month or two ago, I had another guest who mentioned Dark Emu as well.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So tell us a story that kind of pulls together the pieces of your book and gives it an example. Sure.
Could I do 2?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, the first one comes from the Northeast, a fellow named Brendan Smith, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Harlan, Kentucky, in the heart of the Appalachian coalfields a few years ago. But Bren started fishing commercially on the east coast of the U.S. when he was 15 years old, dropped out of high school. Over the next 3 decades, he fished the east coast of the U.S., the west coast of the U.S., even the west coast of Canada. And what he saw was a steady decline in his catch, in the size of the fish, and in the health of the fish. It's just a steady decline. Now, I'm sure your guests know about the challenges of the commons and how overfishing kind of creates a self-perpetuating downward spiral. Well, Bren, very smart guy, working guy, he just decided that the answer was not to push the limit on fishing quotas or anything else. He needed to create a new approach to fishing. So he developed on his own something that he calls vertical ocean farming. It's brilliant. So what he does is he creates 20-acre paddocks, basically, along the coastline. He's doing this off the coast of New York and Connecticut right now. And many other fishermen are now copying the system. And in these paddocks, what he does is he uses vertical columns of ropes, which he seeds with 4 species of shellfish: clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. Clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. On top of that, he has 2 different types of seaweed, seagrass. What happens in this system he's created is that the seaweed creates a very good habitat for all of those bivalves, all of those commercially viable species. It helps clean up the water so that where a lot of parts of the Chesapeake Bay and elsewhere you can't eat the oysters anymore because of all the toxins they're taking in, well, in Bren's system, the water gets cleaned, and so the quality and the cleanliness of these 4 species of seafood is outstanding. On top of it all, the whole little local marine ecosystem rejuvenates so much that commercial fishermen, small-scale commercial fishermen, find that the fish in those sections are much bigger and more vibrant. And to boot, the seaweed is fantastic at sequestering carbon. Seaweed is better per acre at taking carbon out of the air than tropical forests or the best grasslands. So here's a guy who was facing a tremendous decline in his own fortune and in the fisheries. He turned it around where he now has 4 commercial species of shellfish that he raises and sells through local channels. He's got the seaweed that's cleaning the local marine ecosystem while it's helping to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And then on top of that, he harvests the seaweed once a year, dries it, and it makes a high-protein food supplement for either people or livestock. It's, talk about a necessity-driven, synergistic system. It's just amazing. And the best part is that now the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the big U.S. government ocean-based think tanks are all studying Bren's system and working with him. He's a working guy, a fisherman who created it. It's just amazing, just amazing. So that's
how can he do that in public waters?
Well, a lot of it is not public waters. A lot of it's private waters. And that all, that's the devil in the details of all these things is in some cases he's having to negotiate with private landowners who have a certain section. In some cases, he's out far enough that it is public water and he has to get permits to do it. But he's been at this now about the better part of a decade and has apparently been able to work through those kinds of details.
And he's making a good living doing it?
It's apparently quite, I don't know if I want to say lucrative, but quite profitable because it's like small-scale farming, small-scale fishing. It's really tough to make a living, but apparently it's working well enough that now he's got fishermen lined up to go through the sort of training and knowledge building that he does so they can start their own system.
Okay, so what's the lesson from that?
Well, I think it is, number one, that when we face critical ecological problems and critical economic problems, and agriculture and our fisheries are full of both of those, like really declining economic fortunes for farmers and fishermen, typically we pit their economic problems against the environment, and we push the environment more. Plant fence row to fence row, up the fishing quotas. What the biggest lesson from this is, if we look at what Wendell Berry calls solving for pattern, if we look at the patterns of that landscape, we can sometimes find solutions that are much better for the economics of local business and the ecosystem. That's the big takeaway there.
And one of the things about bottom-up is it's all about patterns. One thing that fits beautifully with bottom-up is systems theory chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, and they're all about patterns and relationships and
Right.
studying and understanding them and making them work. So
Right.
exactly that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I love it. Wendell, people have said that in many ways, but Wendell Berry, it was in an essay a good 40 years ago. He called it solving for pattern. And it's so very true. In the book, I explain that, and I talk first about what solving for pattern is not, and I talk about genetically modified corn and soybeans as a solution to a problem of too many weeds on a farm. And so the geneticists came up with herbicide-tolerant corn, Roundup-ready corn and soybeans, which kind of worked for a while, but because it was completely at odds with the pattern of that landscape, oops, sorry about that, because it was completely at odds with that, of course, within about 10 years, we started seeing tremendous herbicide resistance in weeds. So now farms across the country where they've used Roundup-ready corn, soybeans, and other crops have these super weeds that Roundup will no longer kill. So now they're adding additional herbicide resistance to the crop. So it's exactly the opposite of solving for pattern. Whereas it turns out that if you just put a small grain in the crop rotation between the corn and the soybeans, like millet or wheat, you can get a tremendous reduction in weeds and basically eliminate your herbicide use. So again, it's this very different problem-solving approach than what we usually take.
Well, the Monsanto approach is a top-down approach.
Absolutely.
Take this big solution, and the bottom-up approach is to study nature, learn from nature, and interact with the environment and understand the ecosystem.
Right. And you're exactly right. It's very localized. It's very particular to the ecosystem, but it doesn't mean that it has to always stay small, that it has to be a small part of our total way of doing things. Part of what I was trying to say in the book is that if we start connecting the dots between all of these amazing bottom-up economies, we can begin to support them in such a way that they could actually become a big part of our economy and of our approach to the environment, whereas right now they're a small part.
Yeah, I really like that. One of the things that I want to make sure that you cover is you talk about local food and locavores, local business, and you have a phrase for it. What's the phrase you use? I got too many pages of notes here for you here.
Are you talking about the food citizen idea?
Yeah, food citizen. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically, my take on it is you say in the book there are 5 to 10 million people who go to farmers markets each week.
Right.
You've got people who are members of CSAs, community supported agriculture, and I was thinking you've got food co-ops.
Right.
All these people are a potential army of activists who could be doing a lot more.
Absolutely. 20 or so years ago, most Americans had very little consciousness about where their food came from. Over the last couple of decades, with farmers markets, CSAs, food co-ops, and a pretty concerted effort by a lot of farmers and local activists, we now have, still the majority of Americans don't know where their food comes from, and maybe don't care, I don't know. But we have tens of millions that are thinking about that and are trying to act on it. Some of them are making changes because of their concerns about their own health. Some are doing it just because they think the quality of what they can get from a local farmer or fisherman is better, different reasons, but they're now getting engaged. And what I've seen, we've been selling at our farmers market for over 20 years. What I've seen is that more and more people now don't just want to get really good food that tastes good and is organically grown. That's there. But they also are concerned about my welfare as a farmer. 15 years ago, a consumer was primarily like, do you have it or not? What does it cost? What's the advantage? Now we get people that after a big hailstorm, the next day at market, they'll say, how did you do? Are your crops okay? Or in the midst of a drought, they'll say, how are you coming along? Are you getting enough water to your crops? So this initial motivation, I think, as a consumer, which was, I just want to eat better, I don't want to have pesticides in my food, has now progressed to the point that a fair number of those folks are thinking, I got to care about the farmer and his land if I want to eat well myself. So I think the next logical step with those folks is start helping them see the policy issues connected to that. If they really like local farmers and they really like organic agriculture, and they then are helped to understand that out of every dollar USDA spends, less than a nickel goes to anything related to organic or sustainable farming, local food systems, farmers markets, and everything else, then you begin to empower them to say, well, why is that? Why don't our taxpayer dollars support these things that are making me a healthier person and my community stronger?
And instead, what's actually happening is you've got these big, giant food combines, big agra, getting subsidized.
Yes, tremendously, absolutely. Right. Yeah, so there've been some improvements in state and federal policy. There's certain things USDA supports now that they didn't 20 years ago. I give them credit for that. But when you look at the lion's share of the dollars, the vast, vast, vast majority goes to a few big commodity crops, to big agribusiness and the big companies. So as people begin to realize that, we can make them not just conscious consumers, maybe we can turn them into food citizens where they really start thinking about it. And if we can turn them into food citizens, maybe eventually they could be bottom-up economy citizens where they're advocating against the ridiculous subsidies that are given to big boxes instead of going to small local independent businesses. We could really take that view a long way, I think.
And you've got a lot more to say on it. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, progressive news and opinion, available on iTunes, Pacifica, Progressive Radio Network, and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest is Anthony Flaccavento. He's the author of the book, Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up. He's been an organic farmer, a congressional Democratic candidate, and an activist in local food and business. And you've got a 6-point vision in this book. Can you kind of walk us quickly through the different elements of it?
Sure. As I was trying to figure out kind of a framework to talk about these experiences, I wanted to be able to break it down a little bit. And so as I did the research and did the interviews with people whose stories show up in the book, I came up with 6 transitions that I believe we need to make in order to move towards a more just, sustainable, bottom-up economy. The first one is kind of the foundation of it all, and that's the transition from what I call consumptive dependence to productive resilience. And this is, in many ways, getting back to what you were talking about, the native peoples. We're very productive and very resilient. Where I live, in central Appalachia, 100 years ago, people were not wealthy, but they were very resilient and very productive. They made the most out of oftentimes small pieces of land, small bits of timber, that productive resilience. So we're talking about using new technologies, new knowledge and understanding combined with some sort of old-fashioned ethics to reclaim the idea that for this world to survive going into the kind of climate-changing environment we have, there's a lot of things that need to happen, but one thing is that at the local level, starting with the household and moving out then to the neighborhood and the community, we need those local levels to be as productive as possible and as resilient as possible, meaning that they can withstand shock, difficulty, and interruption of services. Put more simply, we need to be able to do for ourselves more.
That's self-reliance too.
Self-reliance, absolutely. So self-reliance is like a critical enabler of resilience. We have to be able to know how to do more for ourselves. Now, there's people who believe that who are survivalists, who are preppers, who think I'm going to build a compound and stock my basement with 5 years worth of canned food. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about households where children learn really important skills of food production and food preservation, of entertaining themselves and their children, of conserving water, of all kinds of things like that, and where those more self-reliant households are linked together in more self-reliant local communities. That the community itself starts to think of itself as meeting a large amount of its needs, not all of it. So that's the first transition. And in the book, I posit that if we don't make that transition, we can't make the others, because we can't just have a sustainable farming system or a green energy system if we all want to live high off the hog, if we all want to consume and consume and consume. We have to get more connected to the limits of our place. So that's the first one.
Okay. Second?
So the second one is then, and it's a logical build on, is moving from trickle-down economies to local living economies. I borrow a term from the group BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economy, that some of your viewers might be familiar with. The idea of a living economy is captured, for instance, by what I described Bren Smith doing, an economy that lives in the nature of the place. So how do we move from trickle-down economics to local living economies? Well, the first thing we do is we look at what are the assets of the place that we have, and how do we make better utilization of those assets? How do we do that? An example from the book comes from a community in Georgia, South Georgia, almost on the Florida line, that was a racially mixed community, about 60-40 white and black, a lot of historic tensions, and also a declining economy because they had been dependent on textiles, which had been offshore. So all the typical problems of a southern town. They tackled this by realizing that part of what they also had was they had stories to tell and to relate. So they started actually bringing their citizens together with a director from New York City, a theater director, and started putting their stories, some of them racially difficult tales that they were telling about their history, some of it the modern situation they were in, and they created something they called Swamp Gravy Theater.
Swamp Gravy
Theater, named after something that was part of their culture, swamp gravy, they called it. So anyway, over a decade in that little town of Colquitt, Georgia, they completely revitalized the town based on telling their stories through plays, which the citizens wrote the plays, they built the sets, they acted the parts. The only professional was the director who came in and pulled it all together. Then on top of it, they added a marketplace that sold some of the goods related to the theater, and then they became a town of murals where local artists started painting murals on vacant buildings. They've essentially recreated their town as a hub for theater and the arts, and in the process have dealt with some of the racial tensions and overcome the economic decline. So that's a local living economy, one of many examples.
It's interesting. One of my other hats, I've been involved in the world of positive psychology for over 30 years, and I organized the first positive psychology and optimal functioning conference. And I presented at the U.S. and the Canadian positive psychology meetings my model of anatomy of positive experience, based on the idea that positive experiences are the building blocks that make us have the capacity for happiness, love, coping with stress, and what have you. And one of the elements is to be prepared for positive experiences by knowing your local environment. And the more you learn about it, the better you can be happy. Well, it sounds like it also means you can also be more economically successful.
Yes, exactly. I mean, again, we've sort of disassociated economic success with personal happiness. We've just assumed that the more you have, the happier you are. But we know for a fact that ain't true anymore, that you can easily surpass a point of affluence where you're happier. But now thinking about how can I both feel more personally fulfilled and at the same time be okay, do well enough economically, we're starting to reconnect those two.
But what I'm getting at is just learning your local history, learning the nature can actually improve the economy.
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, you find opportunities for good things to build on when you do that. And the other thing,
you also include in that section full cost accounting that includes externalities. Now, you mentioned externalities a lot. I learned about externalities from Noam Chomsky.
Mm-hmm.
Because he basically says that they're usually left out in most of the economic models that we have. So talk about
Absolutely.
externalities and where that fits in.
Yeah, I have a little YouTube thing I do on the side called Take Five with Tony, which is these little 5-minute segments where I try to explain some fairly complicated economic topics, but in very plain language using examples. And one of my Take Five episodes from a year or so ago was about externalities. And the way I explained it was I had a sausage biscuit from Hardee's. And I said, this is a pretty tasty sausage biscuit. And it only cost me $1.39. But I wonder what the real costs are. And so we open that up and we see, well, what was the cost of that sausage patty in there? Well, it almost without a doubt came from a gargantuan confined animal feeding operation, a CAFO, probably in North Carolina or Iowa. And that CAFO was not only utterly inhumane for the hogs, but is generating billions of pounds of swine manure that often then ends up in the groundwater or in the creeks or in nearby lakes, which then creates all kinds of health problems for people and creates cleanup costs. And the way our system now works, any one of those costs that is not directly in the sausage biscuit can be externalized where the company doesn't pay for it. Me, the consumer, I don't pay for it. The taxpayers, maybe a couple generations down the road, end up paying for the cleanup.
Well, and then you also got the health aspects of it too. We pay for it with our health insurance, which we spend twice as much on as any other of the advanced countries in the world. I mean, there's so many ways that externalities.
Absolutely. But the bottom line is that the way we evaluate our economy now, the truth is that things that are bad for our health and bad for the environment count more for the economy, because they not only contribute to the economy when you first buy them, but they contribute years down the road when you're paying for the cleanup. And cigarettes are probably the most concise example of that. If you smoke 2 packs a day for 30 years, you pay a little bit and contribute to the economy a bit every time you buy a pack. But when you really contribute to the economy is when you're on a respirator, you got lung cancer, you're being treated.
To the economy.
It's dreadful. So how do we create economies where costs are not externalized? That's the big question, because that's what we're accustomed to doing. And my contention is you can't do that in a completely disassociated global economy. You only do that when the relationships between the people growing or making the stuff and the people eating or buying the stuff are close enough that you can begin to see the real costs in there. You can really have full cost accounting. This is where I think bottom-up local economies, again, open the door to truer, more honest accounting for what our activities actually cost.
I think, well, just the idea that bottom-up looks at all the systems and all the interconnections and the relationships, a true accounting of the costs of producing something using big agri and monoculture, where they take miles and miles, or a whole nation growing the one crop. That really, to me, externalities that are left out of the economic equation are thefts. Thefts from our future.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. I think you're right. Yeah.
So, but we got to move on. We've got 21 minutes to go, and we still got 4 more of your different stages.
So I'll try to speed it up a little or be a little more concise. So we've got these. Transition 1, we need more self-reliant, more resilient and productive households and local economies. Transition 2, as we do that, it opens the door to really understanding what our possibilities are in our place, and that creates the potential for these local living economies. Third one is we not only need economic activity and jobs, we need much more widely dispersed true wealth. So the third transition is from concentrated wealth at the top to real wealth among workers and local communities.
What is wealth?
So I like to, in the book, I use this. I say, a lot of us have this saying, which is, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. But if you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. We've all said that?
Yeah.
What I say is, yeah, unless he doesn't have a boat or a net or access to the water. So educating somebody about how to do something is certainly part of building their capacity. But it isn't just giving more skills and more knowledge, it's actually access to real capital, to real things that make us more productive. This is the essential missing piece if we're going to rebuild wealth and create wealth where wealth has never existed in local communities. So here's a couple examples of that. One comes from New Mexico. There's an amazing organization called La Montanita. It's a food co-op. Started out a couple of decades ago, just a few people getting together once a month in somebody's basement, splitting up the bulk grains and cutting the big wheels of cheese. You know, your old-fashioned 60s, 70s monthly food co-op. It has grown through a very concerted effort now to where they have nearly 17,000 individual members. Now, this is New Mexico. That's a very rural state. Biggest city is Albuquerque, not that big of a town. 17,000 members. They have 6 storefronts, and they're really nice storefronts. In other words, grocery stores, where they buy from over 400 local farmers and food producers in New Mexico. A few years back, they had grown so much that they created their own distribution warehouse. So now the farmers, whether they're raising lamb or goats or beef or vegetables, can bring it all to this warehouse where it's treated in a modern facility and cooled properly and everything else, and then goes back out to the grocery stores. And then most recently, with the wealth that their 17,000 members created, they created a loan fund. So now they take a small portion of the dues that the members pay and turn around and put that into a loan fund for startup farmers, for limited resource growers, and for new food businesses to help them get low-cost capital so they can have a better chance of success. That is real local wealth creation. You've got market opportunities for over 400 farmers, paying much better than they would get if they were selling into the wholesale commodity markets. You've got at least 17,000 members who are eating better, reducing their healthcare costs by eating from what they get at the co-op, and probably many thousand more non-members who shop at their 6 storefronts. And now you've got a loan fund to help capitalize the local producers as well. Just an amazing example of building true wealth in the community.
Now, I think this is a good time to mention a couple things. One, your book is just loaded with scores of examples like this, just a ton of them. Now, before we started, I asked you what's a message you want to get out there, and you said that this is really happening, that this is happening all over the place with lots of people. Yeah. And I think this is a great example of it. There are, I think Gar Alperovitz says that something like 120 million people belong to different kinds of worker co-ops, cooperatives, or those kinds of things. Right. This is happening. This is real. It's doable. It's being done. You, if you're listening, because you obviously are, you can do this. Yeah. You can do this. You can become a part of it. You can start it. And it's not that hard to do. It's exciting. It's fun. It makes you happy to do it. Right. And I don't know if it's okay with you, but if I could sort of skip to the 6th and final one, just because you gave me such a good segue, or I can go back and I can bring it back. Go ahead. So hopefully we'll talk about the 4th and 5th, but the 6th transition is building a bottom-up politics. And what made me think about that is what you said. My contention is that now, if people have some level of caring about the world, maybe it's because they got kids or grandkids, maybe it's just their own place in the world, they want to do the right thing in the world. My contention is we have 2 opportunities, both of which are responsibilities as well, every one of us. One is to be responsible consumers, because the fact of the matter is most of what we get to live is produced by other people. And so what kind of businesses, whether they're farms, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're energy companies, we use our dollars to support, has a profound impact on the world. So shopping at a food co-op, shopping at a farmer's market, sourcing your energy from a co-op in New England, or being part of a community solar array, all of those things are examples of
constructive constructive consumerism that really, makes a difference. But it's not enough. It's not enough. We also have to be citizens. We have to re-engage in citizens. And in my chapter about building a bottom-up politics, I start with the recognition that most people feel so disenfranchised from the political system, and for good reason, because power has been concentrated at the top. And when people say, nobody cares what I think, they just do what they want, they don't listen to ordinary people, they're right. They're right. All the polls show that. But nevertheless, we have to change that. We have to change the policies. We must engage in the policies. And I'll connect it with this. So think about what La Montanita does, the example we just gave, or think about some of the other, as you read the book, you'll see other communities where scores, hundreds of local businesses have started to rebuild a much more diverse, much more interesting, and much better local economy.
Is there a national organization or something that helps local communities start local business support organizations or anything like that? I know you go in some towns and you go to a storefront and you'll see in the window a sign that says this is a local business, part of a local business community.
Right.
Is there a national organization or some more central group that helps make that happen?
Yeah, there's a number of them. The one I'm most familiar with is called BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. BALI has networks, they call them small business networks, all over the country. The one in Arizona has over 3,200 independent local businesses in it. Most of them are smaller than that, have 100, 200, 500. But that's one great resource, either for starting it or for a consumer to find out, well, how do I plug into the local economy? Another one that I think is a little bit different, but is excellent, is the New Economy Coalition. You mentioned Gar Aperovitz. Gar is part of that. And the New Economy Coalition is looking at both practically, how do we build these bottom-up economies, but also how do we impact the public debate and public policy. So those are two good things. The reason I say it's so important to be both a responsible consumer and an engaged citizen comes back to policy. So in my part of Southwest Virginia, where it's far from perfect, but there's been a lot of this local food economy work done. Things are much better than they were a few years ago. Lots of local economy efforts. We had a situation 3.5 years ago where one of the local towns spent $54 million to recruit a Cabela's to come to the outskirts of town. Now this same leader.
No.
Yes, no. The same leaders that put this package together to bring Cabela's, and it's now built 5 miles from the main drag in the town, were also the same people who were pushing the downtown revitalization. So simultaneously, they were trying to revitalize downtown while they're giving $54 million to a big box to come in and build a whole complex of shops around that big box. Well, what's going to happen? People are going to go there, do all their shopping, and never come downtown. So that's an example of public policy that we must change. We've got to move away from this subsidy model to bring big boxes in. And I have a number of examples in the book of where, when they stopped doing that and focused on local businesses, it made an enormous difference.
Now, in that chapter, you list a couple of different kinds of actions. The participatory budgeting, citizens' jury, century town meetings, and deliberative polls. And you give the example of Vallejo, California, and Chicago Alderman Joe Moore. Why don't you talk a little bit about the participatory budgeting? That seems like a really cool concept.
It's really cool. Participatory budgeting is really cool. Started in Brazil, maybe 20-ish years ago. I can't remember the date exactly. And came to the U.S. in 2012. Vallejo, California was the first community to adopt it. It's a town.
I thought you said that Chicago, Joe Moore did it before.
No, I believe it was, well, you may be right. I don't have my book.
Moore was 2009.
But they were about the same time, Vallejo and Chicago. So the point is, Vallejo is kind of more of a mid-sized town, 100,000. Chicago's a big city. It's now big in New York. It's in about 50 different localities in the U.S. right now.
Well, just because you write a book, you forget everything that's in it. I have that happen all the time with my guests. But I just looked at your book today. I just read this today. So Moore didn't do it for the whole Chicago. He did it
No.
just he's an alderman for for the 49th district, and he did it for that.
And he not only did it for that, he did it because he almost lost the prior election.
And then the next election.
So he had just squeaked by in an election where he had always dominated. He was one of those Chicago politicians, and he realized that he was probably going to lose the next election if he didn't have a little different handle, something to connect with the people. Somehow or other, he heard about this participatory budgeting. He launched it there. He won much more handily, and now it's spread to other parts of Chicago. So here's what it is in a nutshell. Really cool. A lot of cities and towns and county boards of supervisors, they'll have citizen advisory groups, and they'll say, oh, we'll get our citizens together to give us advice. Participatory budgeting is where a local government of some sort, from small town to big city, says, we're not just going to ask you for advice, we're going to give you a certain amount of money. You're going to go through a structured process, and at the end of it, you decide how to use the money. You, the citizens, as long as it's legal and feasible, you get to decide. So instead of the advisory thing, which most people have given up on or are skeptical about. So in the case of Vallejo, just as one example, they had come out of bankruptcy as a small town and were looking for ways to recover. And so they launched a participatory budgeting, and essentially hundreds of citizens came together physically. More came in virtually online, and they went through a process of brainstorming what did Vallejo need. If the city was going to give them money, what would they do with it? And after 2 or so days of big brainstorming, they started prioritizing and narrow it down. Then the citizens elected from among that group some representatives to really dive down and to explore each of the priorities in more detail to see which was better. And at the end of the day, this smaller group of citizens representing the larger group came back with their top priority. Meanwhile, Vallejo had said, we're going to give you X amount of dollars. I think in their case, they've given the citizens about $2.5 million over 3 cycles of this participatory budgeting. So about $700,000 or $800,000 a year. The citizens knew how much money they had. They had the priorities there, what they'd like to accomplish, and they said, okay, if we're going to build a new center for young people for after-school activities, that's going to cost X. If we're going to fix the sidewalks in this neighborhood, that's going to cost Y. And they put it all together, and then they actually get the money from the town. So participatory budgeting is, even though it's very, very small parts of the budget that the city gives to you, it's still a way of re-engaging the citizens in a genuine, meaningful way where they feel like their voice isn't just being ignored. Very, very cool, and it's spreading very rapidly.
And then in the book, you explore citizens' juries and century town meetings and deliberative polls, which have some similarity of engaging.
Some similarity, and in those cases, there are different strategies that they've used to grapple with getting citizens together to work through complicated, difficult issues. Right now, we have basically a virtual debate about issues, and that lack of actual connection, actual human connection to other people, has allowed our debate to really degenerate, where we all go to our corners and we come out punching the other guy. The idea of citizens' juries and those other forms is, if you have a complicated, difficult issue, say it's about a land use issue in a place where you've got the environmentalists against the business people or the farmers, then they bring those people together to actually get as much information as they can to talk through what the real trade-offs are and to come up with a set of recommended solutions. And what they've found in those processes is that once the citizens are much more knowledgeable and they have a sense of connection to these other people on the other side, that they come up with better solutions than when we just leave it to the special interests and leave it to the internet debate. So all of them forms of reinvigorating the democracy that I think is so utterly critical right now. And here's one other point I'll make, Rob, is that I don't think you can have a reinvigorated, true, lively democracy where people's voices matter unless you also have a reinvigorated, lively local economies where people's actions matter. I think the two are inseparable.
That's pretty much what I read you saying in the very beginning. I'll read it again. We really can't choose between better local realities and dramatic changes in the larger economic and political system. They go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I wanted to mention is when you make these decisions about buying locally and paying attention to the food and caring about the farmers, you're voting with your wallet. You're voting with your stomach.
Yeah.
And it's a big deal. You know, when you go through a supermarket, they're now describing some of the center aisles, the middle of it, where there's all this processed food as the desert.
Right.
Because more and more people are ignoring those areas.
Right.
And just think about processed food. Just look on the label, and if it's got a really long list of stuff on there, it's probably not that good for you. And it's
right.
And just start not buying it. Buy the healthy stuff.
Right, right.
You know, and you know, you're an organic farmer. I try to eat organic. I can't eat everything organic, and I don't, but I try. You know, there's certain things that I just don't want to eat if it's not organic. You know, real problem is restaurants. If you're going to get food from a restaurant, it's hard to get organic there.
Right.
But boy, that's so important. We've got 3 minutes left. You've got some key lessons that you discuss at the end of the book. Or what are 2 minutes of them, so I can do a station ID at the end.
Okay, sure. So again, first one, we've already said it, but I'll say it one more time. There's really no separating, changing, good local action from good political action. We've got for too long, the people who've been the policy wonks and the policy advocates have been completely estranged from the farmers and the entrepreneurs and the citizens locally trying to make their particular local place better. We must get over that chasm and start thinking about the policy changes that would make local bottom-up economies better. That's lesson number one. Second lesson is that when we get deep into the local economy movement, we're going to need to be making some difficult choices day in and day out. So what I contend is that we need to be frugal in all of our choices. We ourselves need to be frugal, and we need to create more frugal households and communities in order to be able to have the kind of world we want. Again, it's
sustainable. Look at your purchases from a sustainability point of view.
Absolutely.
Not stuff to throw away.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then a third lesson is that there's a lot of joy in this. Towards the end of the book, I give a little sort of personal thing about how I raised my kids through a divorce and some of the challenges and all that. We didn't get it all right. But one thing that I've found is that the whole act of trying to live more frugally, more sustainably, with more self-reliance actually opens all kinds of doors to pleasure, to fun, because the truth is, most of us want to be good at things. We want to be needed. We want to play vital roles in our family and in our community. That's what people fundamentally need, is to feel like they're important. And we've got this great lie that what makes people happy is plenty of money so they can buy.
Yeah, he's locked up. So that may be the last thing I hear from Anthony. Or it might be my internet. I don't know, but I can see I'm still going here. So hopefully you're catching the rest of this. And this is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. I've had as a guest Anthony Flaccavento, who's the author of the brilliant book Building a. Hey,
did I lose you for a minute?
I think it was on my end.
But was there enough there that you can fill in with your